This is a sermon that will be preached at North Shields Evangelical Church on September the 8th, and it's based on 2 Kings chapter 11 and chapter 12, which I'll be reading from throughout this sermon. And we're going to look at 3 things: an incredible ant, incredible apathy, and an incredible anti-climax. I'm just going to read verses 1 to 12 of chapter 11. When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she proceeded to destroy the whole royal family. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, and sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the royal princes who were about to be murdered. She put him and his nurse in a bedroom to hide him from Athaliah, so he was not killed. He remained hidden with his nurse at the temple of the Lord for 6 years, while Athaliah ruled the land. In the 7th year, Jehoiada, the priest, sent for the commanders of units of 100, the Carites and the guards, and had them brought to him at the temple of the Lord. He made a covenant with them and put them under oath at the temple of the Lord. Then he showed them the king's son. He commanded them, saying, "This is what you are to do. You are in the 3 companies that are going on duty on the Sabbath, a third of you guarding the royal palace, a third at the Sur gate, and a third at the gate behind the guard, who take turns guarding the temple. And you who are in the other 2 companies that normally go off duty on the Sabbath are all to guard the temple for the king. Station yourselves around the king, each of you with weapon in hand. Anyone who approaches your ranks is to be put to death. Stay close to the king wherever he goes." The commanders of units of 100 did just as Jehoiada the priest ordered. Each one took his men, those who were going on duty on the Sabbath, and those who were going off duty, and came to Jehoiada the priest. Then he gave the commanders the spears and shields that had belonged to King David, and that were in the temple of the Lord. The guards, each with weapon in hand, stationed themselves around the king, near the altar in the temple, from the south side to the north side of the temple. Jehoiada brought out the king's son, and put the crown on him. He presented him with a copy of the covenant, and proclaimed him king. They anointed him, and the people clapped their hands and shouted, "Long live the king." If you've ever watched a sports event, you'll no doubt have seen a line of players singing the national anthem. Sometimes you can tell that the words really mean something. For example, when the Ukraine football team played their first match after the outbreak of the war, you could tell these words meant something. From the Ukraine national anthem: "The glory and freedom of Ukraine has not yet perished. We'll not spare either our souls or bodies to get freedom." These words really meant something to a nation that was putting its life on the line. In contrast, sometimes you might look at the faces of the players in the England national team and ask, do these words actually mean anything to them? Some players will belt out the words, "God save the King," with gusto. Others will stumble over the words. Some will even look like they're half asleep. The national anthem can be a moment of great passion, but it can also be a moment of simply going through the routine. When the people of Judah crowned Joash king, they also shouted the national anthem. They anointed him, and the people clapped their hands and shouted, "Long live the king." Judah had previously reeled off these same words as part of their tradition, but this time the words really meant something. Newspaper headlines from northern Israel had reported the news of 70 heirs to Israel's throne having their heads chopped off. It was now no longer automatic that the son of the king took the throne. And 6 years ago, Judah had witnessed similar when Athaliah murdered all the males in the royal bloodline, the Davidic bloodline. And she, Athaliah, had taken the throne instead. And during her reign, the nation had gone astray into gross idolatry. Thankfully, one great-great-great-grandson of David had been hidden by his aunt and kept in a tiny room for the last 6 years. His name was Joash. But because Athaliah was queen and violently opposed to anyone else taking the throne, because Athaliah was queen, a priest had to recruit a mini army and arm them with weapons, all in order to place a crown on Joash's head. And so they surrounded Joash, David's great-grandson, with swords and shields, and at that moment they shouted, "Long live the king!" Can you see how these people weren't simply going through the routine? These people really wanted the king to live long, and they knew a king's long reign was not automatic. Anything could change at any time. They could wake up tomorrow with someone else on the throne. Now, in our churches, we generally don't sing the national anthem, but we routinely sing words that express that we want Jesus to reign. For example, in that famous Graham Kendricks hymn, "Shine, Jesus, shine, fill this land with the Father's glory. Flow, river, flow, flood the nations with grace and mercy. Send forth your word, Lord, and let there be light." Now, we're not asking Jesus to physically reign in Buckingham Palace and make the nation a so-called Christian country. Instead, we're asking that King Jesus would reign in people's lives, that more and more people in the UK would call him their Lord and Saviour. Now, that same question again. Do these words actually mean anything to you? Are we singing these words because we're passionate about this becoming a reality? Or are we simply going through the routine, simply saying words that we know that we're supposed to say? The people of Judah really knew the importance of one of David's descendants sitting on the throne. For God had promised to David these words: "When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom." God had promised that one of David's descendants would be king, and the kingdom of this king would be characterized by eternal peace. And the Jewish term for peace, just to note, means not simply the absence of war, but the presence of all that is good. And since Joash was the only descendant of David left, the people of Judah knew how important it was that Joash was crowned. That's why Joash's aunt risked her life to hide her nephew. That's why Jairus' nurse spent 6 years in a tiny room hiding that child. That's why some of the priests worked their day off to have Joash crowned. You can tell the words, "Long live the king," meant something to them. How? By their actions and their sacrifices that they were willing to make. Shine, Jesus, shine. Fill this land with the Father's glory. One word that these words mean something to you would be spending time in your room praying for the spread of the gospel. Over the next 6 years, North Sea Evangelical Church is going to need people committed to doing just that. Flow, river, flow, flood the nations with grace and mercy. One sign that these words mean something to you would be sacrificing in order to give to Christian missions. Just think what a difference you could make if you scaled down from Heinz baked beans to supermarket baked beans and invested the savings in Bible translation. Just think what a difference that small little sacrifice could make. Send forth your word, Lord, and let there be light. One sign that these words mean something to you would be investing your days in anything that brings you into contact with non-Christians. The priests in Judah used their Sabbath day off to appoint Joash king. Their interest in religious activities went beyond a Sunday. Let us do the same. Which takes us from the incredible aunt who hid Joash because she wanted the king to live, to incredible apathy. Incredible apathy. The people's efforts to make Joash king initially paid off. Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the years Jehoiada the priest instructed him. That's from chapter 12, which I'll be reading from. Joash did a lot to help reform the nation after its spiritual and moral collapse in the days of Queen Athaliah. However, Joash recognized that more needed to be done. Chapter 12, verse 3. The high places, however, were not removed. The people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense there. Joash knew that if the people were left to their own devices, they'd go astray eventually. People who worship God in their own way, as they feel led, create a false version of God in their head, one that suits their tastes and imagination. And so Joash focused his efforts on repairing the temple of the Lord, this temple being crucial in people meeting with the one true God. And so Joash said to the priests, "Collect all the money that is brought as sacred offerings to the temple of the Lord, then use it to repair whatever damage is found in the temple." I don't know if you've ever had an important conversation with someone when you can tell they're focused on something else. For example, the BBC journalist stood outside the House of Lords announcing radical reform in government policy, but everyone is more interested in the clown in the background who's taking a whiz behind the bin. Or the flight attendant reading out important safety instructions, but you can tell all the males on the flight are gazing at something else. The teacher telling students that their exam papers have been burned to a crisp in a fire, but the students are too focused on the Paddington Bear underpants poking out the teacher's fly. In much the same way, Joash was telling the priests about massive reform, but the priests were focused on something else. I'll read verses 4 and 5 in full. Joash said to the priests, "Collect all the money that is brought as sacred offerings to the temple of the Lord, the money collected in the census, the money received from personal vows, and the money brought voluntarily to the temple. Let every priest receive the money from one of the treasurers, then use it to repair whatever damage is found in the temple." What were the priests meant to be focused on? The repair of the temple. What were the priests more focused on instead? Money, money, money. Of course, they needed money to rebuild the temple, but the way the writer of 2 Kings records these events, he keeps pointing out how the priests were focused on money more than the rebuilding of the temple. And this was the priests, remember. The priests' ears should have been the ones whose ears pricked up at the moment of the sound of religious forms. But their eyes and ears were taken up by something else. But by the 23rd year of King Joash, the priests still had not repaired the temple. Therefore King Joash summoned Jehoiada the priest and the other priests and asked them, "Why aren't you repairing the damage done to the temple? Take no more money from your treasurers, but hand it over for repairing the temple." The word money is mentioned 14 times in the first 16 verses. 13 times it is in relation to the priests who kept back the money designated to repair the temple. This was despite them being paid a fair wage. 13 out of 14 times the word money is used. It is in relation to the priests who kept back the money designated to repair the temple. Whereas one of the 14 times, that the word money is used. It's in relation to someone else. Verse 13. The money brought into the temple was paid to the workers who used it to repair the temple. They did not require an accounting from those to whom they gave the money to pay the workers, because they acted with complete honesty. Those employed full-time to focus on religious things, the priests. These priests focused more on money than they did the rebuilding of the temple. In contrast, these non-religious builders were focused on the repair of the temple, only half concerned with the wages in their pocket at the end. The everyday workers were enthusiastic. The priests were apathetic. And I wonder if there is a challenge in this for us religious people today. Just imagine we attend a church meeting to discuss changes that might be needed as a church. We spend 10 minutes on item 1. How can we better engage the community around us? We spend 30 minutes on item 2. Should we invest the extra 20 pence in a better brand of loo roll, upgrading from quilted velvet to quilted velvet scented with cucumber and coriander? This would be a sign that we'd lost focus, more focused on the trivial than the important. Or imagine we appoint a new pastor to lead us in some reform as a church. Imagine he stands at the front of the church and says, from next week, we'll be meeting at 10:45 in order to better engage the lost people in North Shields with the glorious good news of Jesus Christ, our loving Saviour, and theirs. What words are the focus of my attention? The lost people of North Shields, their desperate need for the gospel, the love of the Saviour who gave his life for me and for them. Are these my focus? Are these my concern? Are these my priority? Or am I more focused on the 15 minutes change, a change that might help other people access church, but would inconvenience me? Now, just to be clear, the priests had to focus on money in order to do their job. The church has to spend time deciding the toilet roll that it buys. The pros and cons of church times for everybody has to be considered. And we're not considering any of the change in church time, just by the way. This was an example. But it'd be really sad if we didn't make the main things the main thing. And what is the main thing a church is supposed to be about? Toilet roll, the translation of the Bible that we use, the style of music that predominates, getting through the service without some disruptive child making noise. Is it about maintaining traditions that serve our love of nostalgia? Is it about paying our heating bills to keep our Christianity comfortable but risk-averse? I don't think these things are the main focus of the people in my own church. I'm simply trying to point out how easy it is for God's people to focus on the wrong things, making lesser things the main things, and making the main things item 11 on the 10-point agenda. Which takes us from an incredible apathy to an incredible anti-climax. Imagine, after reading 2,000 pages in the latest detective novel, Vera reveals that the victim died of natural causes. Imagine, after years of bitter rivalry, heavyweight boxing fans finally got to see the duel they've all been waiting for. Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury. Only for Tyson Fury to choke on a strepsil on his way into the ring. Imagine, after judging over 10,000 auditionees, over 15 weeks of Britain's Got Talent, Simon Cowell finally announces that everyone's a winner. What are these all examples of? They're all huge anti-climaxes. But the anti-climax in chapter 12 is even bigger. Chapter reading from 2 Kings chapter 12 verses 11 to 18. When the amount had been determined, the priests gave the money to the men appointed to supervise the work on the temple. With it they paid those who worked on the temple of the Lord, the carpenters and builders, the masons and stonecutters. They purchased timber and blocks of dressed stone for the repair of the temple of the Lord, and met all the other expenses of restoring the temple. The money brought into the temple was not spent for making silver basins, wick trimmers, sprinkling bowls, trumpets, or any other article of gold or silver for the temple of the Lord. It was paid to the workers who used it to repair the temple. They did not require an accounting from those to whom they gave the money to pay the workers, because they acted with complete honesty. The money from the guilt offerings and sin offerings was not brought into the temple of the Lord. It belonged to the priests. About this time, Hazael, king of Aram, went up and attacked Gath and captured it. Then he turned to attack Jerusalem. But Joash, king of Judah, took all the sacred objects dedicated by his predecessors, Jehoshaphat, Jerome, and Ahaziah, the kings of Judah, and the gifts he himself had dedicated, and all the gold found in the treasuries of the temple of the Lord and of the royal palace, and he sent them to Hazael, king of Aram, who then withdrew from Jerusalem. In the climax of a story, the promises of the rest of the story are meant to be fulfilled. In a whodunit, the author promises to reveal whodunit. In a talent show, the judges promise to announce a winner. But what we see in chapter 12 is the promises of hundreds of years go unfulfilled. What was that promise? Well, God had said, I will give one tribe to Solomon's son, so that David my servant may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem, by raising up a son to succeed him, by making Jerusalem strong. Nevertheless, for the sake of his servant David, the Lord was not willing to destroy Judah. He had promised to maintain a lamp for David and his descendants forever. God had made a promise that one of David's descendants would reign as king, and, like a lamp, this king would bring light to the nation. Year after year, God's people had been waiting for such a king. Brick by brick, they'd seen Joash bring about much-needed reform. Job after job had been ticked off the to-do list. The temple had been built, people were worshipping God again, and they thus had a son of David, maybe even the son of David, to thank. And then, whilst the paint in the temple was still drying, Joash strips the temple of its object of worship. Joash murders the son of the main godly influence in his life. Joash turns his back on God and leads the nations into idolatry yet again. If you read 2 Kings 12 and 2 Chronicles 24 side by side, you'll see the biggest anticlimax in the history of the nation. It was such an anticlimax. The one they put their hopes in let them down. It's as if God is displaying a massive billboard with the words, no matter how great the human is, they will eventually let you down. Those with romantic hopes will be let down by the one they hope to transform their life. Those with political hopes will be let down by the leader who will finally bring about much needed reform. Those with health-related hopes will be let down by the psychologist who only has a limited capacity to help us or explain us emotionally. However you are trusting to bring light into your world, one day they will disappoint you, no matter how good they may be. Let this be a lesson to us all today. It's for reasons like these I cannot end this sermon saying, we are the key to bringing light to North Shields, or I am an example of how to be a witness to unbelievers, or Once we recruit a pastor, inherited gifted members from Christchurch, then we'll see a massive corner. We'll turn a massive corner. I cannot end this sermon saying these things. Instead, we must end this sermon looking away from people towards the one chapter 12 points us to. Contrast Joash, a son of David, to Jesus, the son of David. Joash sought to renew the nation's spiritual life by rebuilding the temple. But no amount of physical rebuilding could change the people's hearts. That's the reason they slipped back so easily into idolatry all over again. In contrast, King Jesus has the capacity to change people's hearts. Jesus has the capacity to bring about inward change. Joash appeared to care about the people's spiritual welfare. But the moment the king of Aram surrounded Judah, Joash stripped the temple of its object of worship in order to bribe the king of Aram to turn around. Joash could have risked his life as he, the king, led the people into battle. But he cared more about his own life than the people's spiritual welfare. In contrast, King Jesus gave up his life for you and for me. People placed their hopes in Joash and his temple project. But this temple project failed, and throughout Israel's history, we see that the temple would have to be rebuilt again and again and again. In contrast, King Jesus told the Jews that this was the way he'd prove that he was the king. Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Jesus proved that he was not just any king, but the king, the son of David, the light, the one God had promised. Jesus proved this when he died and his body figuratively referred to as the temple. Jesus proved this when his body was raised from the dead to life again. It is towards Jesus that we need to look for any hope of any individual spiritual reform, any progress in our lives. It is towards Jesus we need to look for any hope of increased spiritual life in the community in which we live.